Hey guys, Rich from Rich Me Gaming. Hope everyone is doing fantastically well. Really excited for today's episode because we have a very special guest with us. Will, how are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I'm in my element because I'm back in my laundry room. It's been like 2 or 3 months now that I haven't gotten to stream from here. So this
The
is
fame,
this is
the
the true
famous
home when it
laundry
comes to
rooms
stuff like
from
this.
Twitch. We all love them. We all
That's
loved
right.
it.
That's right.
So this is, guys, you all know who this is. I don't know why I need to introduce him, but Will Shick from Atomic Mass Games. So, Will, first of all, thank you for agreeing to do this with me. Really appreciate it. I know we've got our, predetermined questions that we've gone through
hmm
already, but if you want to just start by, I suppose, just giving us a quick, how did you guys get here, right? Because it must be a pretty exciting journey from going like, I imagine one of you had a thought one day of, we could make a really good game around Marvel, and 2, 3 years later, you've got a game that is, first of all, absolutely brilliant, but second of all, the community is just growing and growing and growing, and it seems like there's so many people moving away from other games and coming over to Marvel Crisis Protocol.
Yeah, I can give a little bit of a history on the crazy ride that has been the last like 4-ish years or whatever year it is now. I don't know. Time is like so meaningless. Especially when we talk about this a lot because I'll go off on tangents the whole time. But like game development in itself is like a weird time traveling system because you have to live. Our production timelines are 18 to 24 months ahead. So you have to live in this world where you're like 2 years in front of everybody, but then also come back to the present to do interviews or to hop on a stream and paint like the latest character that you were super excited about 18 months
two
ago
years
and now
ago,
you finally
yeah.
have. I know. And you're like, so it's cool because you get to like experience the excitement and everything like twice. But it's also weird because like I have no idea what day it is. My wife is a true saint because she'll be like, I'm doing this thing today. I'm like, okay, that's great. And then I'll forget. And I'll be like, I thought that already happened, or I thought that was like later on. And she's like, no, no, no. She hasn't put me on a Google Calendar yet, but I bet you she does eventually because
Oh,
like I'm just getting worse.
I'm already there. Like me and my
Yeah.
partner have to do that already because if not, we just end up agreeing to 10 other things that happen on that same day as well. So yeah, completely get that.
But yeah, so like I started, I think like a lot of folks out there in the community do, right? I got in through collectible card games and stuff. I wound up my local comic book store, which I frequented, was a great spot. They brought in tabletop miniatures games um, as like a new product when I was 12. So I was like, this is super cool. I had done model airplanes with my dad and like modeling and stuff with him. And some of my favorite memories with him are hanging out, sniffing that terrible horse glue, that plastic cement smell that is just awful, but at the same time, completely nostalgic.
It's like home.
Yeah, in the basement and just having a good time building World War II model airplanes. And so, for me, like putting things together and painting them was exciting. I thought that was really cool, and of course, the game itself seemed really awesome. Like it hit me at that point where it's like, okay, you're a little too old to play with action figures. Although I later learned that you're never too old to play with action figures because I still do it,
Absolutely not.
and I get to pretend like it's okay because I do it with my kids. But it was like that nice transition of I still wanted to live out fantasies and narratives on a tabletop in a place, and so I got super into it. I became like at 13, I was the local tournament organizer for my store on all these events. I ran intro days every week and all this stuff. I got super into it. Um, and so my family would always be like, "So when are you going to turn that into a career?" And I always thought that was silly. I was like, "Why would I do that? This is my hobby. I just love it." I always expected, I went to school and decided I was going to teach and do all of that, and I did it for a little bit. But then I just randomly got an opportunity to get into the industry, so I was able to jump in, and it was great. It was really challenging. It was really rewarding. It was very interesting, but I got to learn the ropes. And one of the neat things about tabletop gaming in general is that you often get to wear a lot of different hats. Get to wear a lot of different hats. A lot of times you have to wear a lot of different hats, because every studio is pretty small, and it's really important to be very team focused, and you get to work with amazing people, and you get to feed off each other, and it becomes a very collaborative environment. And so I was able to accumulate a lot of skills, and I kind of reached a point where, I was ready to take the next step in my journey, basically. And as luck would have it, I kind of assumed that next step was going to be out of the industry. But as luck would have it, I got approached by Asmodee, and they were looking to set up a new miniatures game studio, specifically to handle the Marvel license that they had just acquired. And I was fortunate enough through a whole series of circumstances to get the opportunity to start Atomic Mass Games with several folks that I had worked with and formed really strong relationships with throughout my time in the industry. So four of us, went on this magical journey to create a Marvel's miniatures game and start Atomic Mass Games. And so it was myself, Will Pagani, Marco, and Dallas Kemp. And man, those days were crazy because it was just four of us trying to create this amazing game, learn hard plastic, push ourselves to do things that we wanted to do in other positions that we'd been. And you always get that moment where it's like, be careful what you wish for, because you just might get it. And then all of a sudden it all falls, it all comes down. It's like, okay, this is the moment. You're either going to rise to it, or you're going to stumble and you're going to learn things along the way. And one of the things that was really exciting about that time is, we always knew we weren't going to get it perfectly right. But like we always tell people on stream, if you look at anything in your life, your career, your hobby, your relationships, as there's an end point and there's a win point, and the goal is to succeed every time, you kind of miss out. Like the actual point is to always constantly get better. Succeeding does have a dopamine hit to it, but I find the dopamine hit to be way better when I look at something and be like, I didn't do it very well this time, and then I do it again. And the second time I do it, I do a little bit better. And I'm like, look how much better I've gotten, right? It's constant improvement.
Yeah.
If I lived in an MMORPG, I just, my excitement would come from the little level ups every time, right? Constant, consistent improvement, even when you plateau, that's the thing. It's, and I think that's been one of the exciting things about Atomic Mass, is that we've been fortunate enough that through hard work, and talent and everything else that we've had, and the support we've had along the way, which I say there were four of us when we started, but we had an amazing support group from Asmodee as well, and that can't be discounted. We had help in terms of the great production staff that they have, who work with the factories and had done a lot of research on hard plastic and could help us with questions and worked actively with us when we were like, well, we want to do this thing with Doctor Strange. And they'd be like, "Rrr." And then so we'd set up calls and we'd talk about it, and they would come back with solutions and options. We had amazing support from the licensing staff at Asmodee, helping us forge relationships with Marvel and work us through some of the hiccups that could happen, providing feedback on okay, well, you can't really do this, you should do this. This will help you get through faster, and just navigating those waters, and also just being an amazing support staff in terms of assisting us through some of the learning process of how does the studio interact with Asmodee. And of course, we had great help from the higher ups, director of publishing Steve Horvath and things like that, his support staff. It was fantastic. So there were four of us, working constantly on this Marvel game and being like, we got to get it right. But at the same time, we had that great support structure underneath us too. And over time, we got to advance and control. And there's this really neat thing about working on something that nobody knows about, and kind of looking out from the outside and be like, oh, you have no idea what's coming, right? And both exciting and terrifying, because you're like, I think, internally, and with all our great play testers as well, who can't be discounted, for any of the projects that we work on. We were like, we think we have something really good. Everybody who's looked at it is they're very excited. This is going to be great. Imagine what's going to happen when it gets out there, right? And you watch people, and then the big announcement came. We revealed ourselves to the world at Gen Con, and then the product launched in November of 2019, and it was phenomenal. It was very exciting, and of course, we had all of this work in process. We had done so much front-loaded work, because one of the things that we knew from our shared experience working on tabletop miniatures games for so long was that, you know, if we were going to do it and we were going to do it well, then we had to do so much front loaded work. And I think this will transfer into some of the questions we're going to talk about first or next. But, you know, we had plans for characters through 2023 at the time, which was really ambitious because those plans have mostly gone into tatters. But we needed to know like where we were going, what was the goal. And we had, you know, we were very adamant that when we reveal this game at Gen Con, we're going to show people not just the core box, we're going to show people, you know, that there is a strong release plan and we have a long-term view of this game, because we did. And so, you know, Dallas, I think, lost a lot of his few remaining hairs working on getting, like, I think we had the first 4 waves painted and ready at Gen Con,
Oh, wow.
which was a lot. You know, I think we went up through some of the Guardians were at Gen Con. We didn't have Drax because we showed him at PAX Unplugged later. But it was a big deal. So, you know, from a development and design standpoint, that's amazing because you get to play test and balance with a much wider set. And that ideally lets you get more understanding of the game and to create a more cohesive environment and to bring things out. But of course, you know, as things continue, the studio grows, the player base grows, the community grows around it. We always tell people, no matter how many games you play internally, even with our amazing group of play testers who play a lot, and we also play quite a bit internally as well in between our other duties, for all of our games, it's like you're never going to match what happens when a game gets released to the wild. And so you learn a lot from that, and you discover a lot of things there, and you know, you just get better. This goes back to that steady progression. You're gonna make mistakes. You're gonna learn from those mistakes, and sometimes you're not gonna make mistakes. You're just gonna get better at what you do. Right? That's craftsmanship. Like, I made this amazing thing, but now I'm gonna make it better. So we added on staff. We added the infamous Josh Colon. He came in as our marketing coordinator. We added the amazing Melissa, who became our product line manager at the time. We brought on one of the amazing freelancer who had worked with us on graphic design, Jesse. So the team grew and everything was going amazing. And then last year, as many people probably know, we had a great moment where we got to grow again. And so during that time, as the studio was being initiated and stuff, I had taken on the role as head of studio. And so I was kind of responsible for overseeing the entirety of the studio development. And that's, you know, from the business side and being the contact point for our relationship with Asmodee and also the licensors and everything else. It's challenging. We go back to the lots of different hats things. But then last year when Asmodee decided to transfer and merge all of the miniatures into one studio, which happened to be Atomic Mass Games, we grew to a point where I was like, okay, we really need to have somebody dedicated and very knowledgeable and very business savvy in that head of studio role, which I was more than happy to be like, that is not the role for me. I'm much more on the creative and game development and design side and looking at product strategies internally. So Simone Elliott, who was my amazing kind of overseer from Asmodee originally, decided to step in, and we had formed such a great relationship, and she had a lot of love for what we did and a lot of great understanding for both the licensed properties. She was the director of licensing for Asmodee for quite a while before she stepped into kind of overseeing all of the studio relationships between Asmodee and on the US side, I should clarify. So she came in and she took over the head of studio deal, and I became the Robin to her Batman, and that was fantastic. So I used the wrong one, but Marvel doesn't have, I don't think Marvel has a lot of great, like, identifiable sidekicks immediately.
Yeah, I was just trying to, there isn't any really sort of the equivalent of the dynamic duo, is there? Yeah.
No, not really. So
I'm sure there'll be people screaming at us down in the comments with like
there might
reeling off loads and loads of examples, but I can't think of any off the top of my head.
I guess
Maybe you're the Wong to her Strange. I don't know if that's like the.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd be fine with that. I was gonna say like maybe you could go with the Bucky, to her World War II Captain America.
Well, there we go. That's one.
What an interesting tidbit, because why not? Stan Lee was actually like really against young sidekick characters. Like he didn't believe in them as like a trope. And I think that's why it's so difficult to find like a young Ward, because it just wasn't a thing that he felt. I can't remember the reasons why, but there's a whole talk about, the creative teams and being like, well, he didn't like that, so that's why you don't see a lot of that in Marvel.
Yeah, there's a few, isn't there? Just now thinking like you've got like Kate Bishop and Iron Lad and a few of those, sort of characters, but they tend to be ones that then picked up the mantle from the character that was then retired, rather than like actually, doing whatever it is they do together. So. Yeah,
the vast majority, like they're always very much heroes and main characters in their own right, which is a little different.
Yeah.
So anyway, so she came in and she took over that, and of course, the studio has expanded. We've brought in a lot of amazing people from that, and it's been fun to just kind of expand what we do. And it's been a very busy time, but it's been awesome. And that kind of brings us to the point of now where we have, all these amazing folks that you get to see and interact with during mini extravaganzas. And then of course the core team that's still there and working very hard. And the new core team that came over and brought the Star Wars knowledge and everything with them as well. So that's kind of like the history of the studio in a nutshell. I'm very much looking forward to the next 4 years and what they bring, and I think there's a lot of excitement to it, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about kind of that philosophy going forward too, in terms of how we always want to make sure that everything's planned for the future, and we have a very long view on everything. So that it's been wild.
The one good thing is that with both of those universes that you're looking after, whether it be Star Wars or Marvel, they are so vast that I imagine it's probably harder to work out who you're going to do next and what you're going to focus on next, rather than like scrambling around for material to look for, because they are just huge universes, right? Whether it's the written word or whether it's the big cinematic universes as well. So one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the game itself, where it is today, sort of how you see it moving in the future. But one of the things I want to touch on first was around what you guys have been doing with the errata cards quite recently. Obviously announced at Ministravaganza. I think you took everyone by surprise. Me and one of the guys who's on the channel quite a bit, Quinn, had wrote down a list of all the things that we were expecting, and we were watching it live and doing almost a Ministravaganza bingo, crossing off what we got right and what we got wrong. And then just the curveball that was, first of all, Hulkbuster having a leadership ability, I think knocked everybody off their feet. That wasn't anything anybody expected. And then the second one was when you showed us, I think it was just the 4 errata characters, wasn't it, on the Ministravaganza, but then the announcement that there was, the sort of first wave up until the X-Men were being reviewed and looked at. And I think, first of all, from my side, and I think I speak for the vast majority of the community when I say this, is we all really appreciated that. I think the saddest thing for anyone when they're playing a game, particularly like Marvel, in that it's, I would see it as more of a skirmish game, but every character is a hero. I was talking to somebody in my local gaming store last week because they were watching me play a game of Marvel Crisis Protocol, and they were saying, "Oh, I'm not really into the painting," and they played Star Wars Legion, which obviously another good game. But I said the one difference from the painting side, the hobbying side, is that every character you create is, or you paint up, is completely different. You're not having to rank and file, churn out 25 stormtroopers to be ready for your game at the weekend. And I just said, look, the ones that I take the most time over are the ones that I enjoy the most, my favorite characters. I think there's nothing worse as somebody coming into this who loves a certain character but feels like they couldn't play that character because they just weren't competitive, or not even competitive enough, but just weren't good enough on the battlefield compared to some of the newer releases. So I think, first of all, a thank you for doing that, because I think it could have been so easy for you guys to just release Hulk Worldbuster and forget that Hulk ever existed, or a Secret Avengers cap and forget the original one. But going back and errataing those, I think was a really cool thing. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the thought process and how you decided which characters were going to get the errata, but then also how you decided what that errata was going to be.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, I think the discussion really about all of that came naturally from, as I talked about before, even when you do something really well, the more you do it, the better you get, right? Anything creatively minded, I mean, anything in life is just a progression of improvement, especially if you approach it that way. So, we always knew that we were, the goal is to release something that at the time we're very proud of and we believe is great. But once that thing is released, we're always asking ourselves the question, okay, how do we beat it? How do we make it better? What can we do? What can we do to improve? Because, to ever come to a state where you're like, well, everything we're doing is completely right and there's no room for improvement. One, I think that's super boring and I lose my interest very quickly. But two, I think it's completely disingenuous because you can always find places to improve. And I think that's part of the drive and the passion of what keeps us going as a studio. So, we're always looking for that next step. When it came to kind of, again, I mentioned how no matter how many games you play internally of something when you're a designer or a developer on the stuff, no matter how many playtest groups you have, the second that thing hits the wild, it's just all bets are off. The way in which players approach stuff, the way in which players' mindsets are. When you have an amazing community built up of players who are all viewing these things differently, with different lenses and different thoughts, you get some very creative solutions to problems that you didn't even know were there. And I think, originally we did all of this work with this very, very big initial group of characters because we wanted to have this very fine-tuned thing. That was both great and then, of course, also a little bit of a negative because that first group of like 50 characters ish was designed kind of in a vacuum, right? And that would have happened no matter how we approached it. If we had just done the core set to death and released that, then the core set's designed in a vacuum, right? And that's why you want the widest sample size possible, and why we pushed ourselves to have so many things in design and development at the same time, so that we get as wide a view as possible of how the game played, what new things would bring in, how our structures and our internal rules for like, we will do this in Marvel Crisis Protocol, we will not do this in Marvel Crisis Protocol, in terms of design and development would work. But of course, as you improve, it just kind of means that you learn lessons maybe a little bit quicker, or you get to apply those things to the next batch. And these are living games. The analogy that I always give every time I talk about design and development, that I think has been my favorite after working on this stuff and in this capacity for a long time, is that when you're working on something that's a living game, so I don't know if this necessarily applies to like every type of tabletop game, but when you go in and you say, okay, I want to create a game that is going to last, that is going to have constant refreshing like points, it's going to have consistent releases, it's going to grow and expand, you have to view it like a garden. So you do all of your planning, you figure out where you're going to plant everything, you plant all that stuff, you tend to it, you water it, weeds grow, things grow out of like sync with each other. That's why people go in and they trim hedges. That's why yard work is, good yard maintenance is like serious, right? Anyone who's tried to have a nice backyard, mine is not, by the way, I hate gardening, but I love the metaphor, knows, right? It's a painful process. You rip weeds out of the ground, you trim trees, you clip hedges, you do damage in order to maintain and preserve the beauty of the whole, and to make sure that things grow according to like the vision and everything. So we got to a point where, we were looking at stuff and we'd gotten past the X-Men, and we had a moment of kind of like, the pandemic was interesting in terms of that, because of all of its effects in terms of releases and everything else. We also wound up at a point to where we had some time for a little bit of introspection and reflection, because of how schedules had shifted. And when we started looking, we're like, well, what you always think, I think every person who's ever painted a miniature knows this feeling specifically, you always think as you look at it on your shelf a week or a month later, like, oh, I wish I had done this differently. I wish I'd done this a little differently. Maybe I could have done this better. That's the constant discussion the whole time. What we talk about when it comes to our design and development philosophy is, a lot of people are like, well, the best games are the perfectly balanced games. It's like, they're really not. Because what you want in game development, what we want in game development, I guess, and when I say what you want, I'm always referring to what we want. There are different opinions, and your mileage may vary, but know that I'm not one to speak in all absolute truths except for my truth. So don't get mad at me, or you don't have to come at me if you don't agree. That's fine. We can debate it and discuss, and maybe we'll shift our perspectives a little bit. I'm always happy to do that, but I'm not trying to give you like the absolute truth here. But what we always talk about is, the games are interesting, especially tabletop games, because of player decisions. And Marvel Crisis Protocol is one that's really designed around players making the best of what they have and solving puzzles at the table. There are games that are really strong on turn zero play. Thinking about, okay, if I take this, and this, then I do these things in this order, everything will work out. And there's a set of players that love that higher strategy, lower tactical kind of like decision making, where so much of the game is front loaded, and the game itself is kind of like, how well can you execute on what you planned. With Crisis Protocol, we wanted almost all of the decision making and all of the game experience to come from the actual table play. So turn zero matters, but what really matters is how you adapt and evolve based on the situation that's presented to you. This goes into like roster construction and why you don't know what the crisis is, and ties back into some of the tweaks that we made around that, which were part of the changes that we discussed at Mini Stravaganza, and then just how characters operate. So part of that is saying, okay, well, every character has to be unique and different and flavorful, and that means that you're gonna nothing's gonna be at the same line, right? The goal of our design is to have the curve of slightly underpowered, slightly overpowered, and everything in the middle be as tight as possible, but to never have these two things touch. Because once they touch, then they're exactly like, the only way to make them touch is to say, okay, character X, Y, and Z are all the same. Yeah. They have the exact same numbers, they do the exact same thing, and that's it. And it's like, I mean, it's not even really checkers, because in checkers you can king yourself and then all of a sudden you respond differently, but it's pretty close. And I think like the thing is, right, is it's okay for something to be slightly, what you want, like you talked about, is you want things that maybe aren't the most efficient choice. There are players that will search out efficiency above all else. They'll say, what is the most efficient choice? And I will take that. And that's how you get that curve. What you want is, you also want players who say, well, I like making the not most efficient choice work because I like the puzzle, I like the challenge, and I will let my player skill override any deficiencies that come from that. And you want to make sure that that balance is right there, so that those two things can live. And then if those two things can live, then it says, okay, well, I really love Captain America. He's my favorite. He had an amazing impact on how I grew into be an adult, and my views on the world, and what makes a strong and good person. Captain America. So I will always play Captain America. You want that person to be able to take Cap and to learn through skill and practice and clever tactics on the table to, be able to compete equally with somebody who just takes the most efficient thing, right? To a close to 50-50 success. And that will always vary, because nobody's skills are identical and the situations aren't identical, and there are dice. And dice completely randomize things. They're kind of the great equalizer in some ways. Although I think many people have dice vendettas where they're like, the dice never work for me. And that might be true. Variance is a very tricky mistress to try to solve. So this is kind of like all long-winded, and I get off on these like very rambly things because there's just so much to try to convey. But it was really important to us to kind of go back and say, okay, well, has our curve like grown too much? And I think what we determined is that it kind of had. It had moved to a point to where, that the two ends of the spectrum were moving a little further away than we liked. And another thing that came to it, and kind of the original core of the conversation was, it was really important to us to maintain a single entry point in terms of the core set for Marvel Crisis Protocol. Because I think many of us worked in the retail sector as well. You know, both Pagani and Dallas owned their own game stores at one point in their lives. So we always try to take a very balanced approach in terms of, we want a game that is great for players, but we also want to be very cogent of how the game and the communities are built around those at the core fundamental stage of the LGS. And so having that singular entry point be the big hit has, in our experience, consistently shown that is a great way to build community. There's not a lot of questions. There's not a lot of decision making. It's just like, hey, here's a box filled with all these characters that you probably know and love, or at least have been exposed to in some way. That's how you get in. It has everything you need and you're ready to go. How amazing. And from there, you can start to explore and find different things. So maintaining the value of the core set as well, making it so that, you know, when somebody's like, how do I get started? Well, you pick up the core set. It wasn't, you'll probably not use most of those characters after you learn the game, right? That's not a good core set.
Yeah.
Even if it gives you everything that you need and it's an amazing value, the value also has to come into the fact that, like, you're going to use some of those characters. They're going to be mainstays for you, depending on your play style, depending on your character preference, that kind of stuff. So, so that also, like, we started the conversation with, okay, you know, if this is the core set, what would we adjust and who would we adjust in it to make sure that that core set value remains the same, and to pull our band back together. And then, of course, once we discussed that, it was then, okay, well, why don't we look at the first initial batch, because effectively those first 50 characters were the core set for us, and adjust as well based on, like, what we learned, you know. Things like Hulk is an interesting one. You know, when Hulk came out initially in that first batch, he was kind of a monster. He was very difficult to deal with. As very quickly those more and more releases came, players determined strategies and learned how to very quickly, like, take care of Hulk. And Hulk also, in playtesting, you know, and everything, was so oppressive within the subset of what he was being tested against, and kind of the mentality of everything, all the players that were there, and all of our games, that he got tuned in order to not be the top of the pile, so far the top of the pile that he broke the curve. And, you know, as the game evolved, as play strategies like, you know, all you've got, double tap, follow me's, husband and wives, all these things, you know, they were able to play more and more against, there were more answers to the questions that Hulk asked. And I think there was, you know, because of trying to balance Hulk accordingly and within the subset of characters that were there, he didn't quite hit the marker of what people believed or wanted from the Hulk, which was this reckless, like, run into the middle of the field and start punching things.
Hulk smash, basically. That's what.
Yeah. You know, I think it was one of those things where he was very successful at it initially, but then quickly got outpaced as people figured out how to deal with that. And, you know, those are some, like I said, you don't get everything right perfectly the first time. And I think we knew pretty early on that there were definitely things that we would go back and kind of, like, adjust and tweak. And that list, you know, kind of changed and evolved as we evolved and learned more about the game. And of course, the field got wider. And as the field gets wider, you have more answers to questions. So you can ask harder questions, which is one of the fun things too about game design, and leads to kind of unique takes on things and how you're going to do things and stuff like that. So, and then there were places where, you know, we kind of tuned a little too much. MODOK was a great example for a long time of a character that was strong in that initial batch. But the more the field expanded, the more the things that he specifically could do remained even more and more viable, right?
Yeah.
So you can have, there are two different tracks. There's the really strong initially, but then as more answers to your question come up, you become weaker. Or there's the really strong initially, and as more questions come up that you answer, you become
stronger and stronger. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it was definitely the chance to kind of go back and reevaluate everything. And I think it's important, you know, to note, you asked about, like, what was the driving force behind our character selection, and why did we pick certain characters over others? You know, again, we go back to that band. And so it was really looking at, okay, what are our outliers? Like, how do we smoothly push things back in? And the big mantra, the big trap that comes back is that perfect balance, right? Oh, we know so much more now. We can make MODOK equal to everything else. Like, we can push him to the middle. And it's like, don't do that. The point is not to push things to the middle. The point is to push the bands closer together.
Yeah.
So in some cases, we made changes that, you know, were very moderate, taking Shuri's Panther Gauntlets and adding a push restriction to it, which, as I think more and more stuff has come out, people have kind of like very quickly noticed that one of the initial design things that we weren't thinking of at the beginning was how important having pushes and throws have size restrictions on them was to the game, because we hadn't really, even though we had all these characters we knew we wanted to do, we didn't have the experience to tell us having somebody who can just push any size of things is like really, really good. We knew it was good.
Yeah.
That was the point. That was the point. But you just, sometimes you don't comprehend how good something is. And again, this kind of goes back to the MODOK thing. This is really good. Oh, the more questions that this answers, the better it gets.
Although I am disappointed that Kingpin isn't going to be able to judo throw Dormammu anymore. That was a disappointment for some people, I think. But it makes sense as well. It makes sense in the context
and everyone
of that.
was like, he's not, Kingpin, depending on the creative team and the run, varies in strength and power level. There's the runs that I always remember from Spider-Man. It's like, he's like, people think I'm a big guy, but I'm like 90% muscle mass. I'm like, oh my gosh, you can bench press anything. I always viewed Hail to the King less as like he was throwing you with his body and more like he was just throwing you with his kingpinness. Like Wilson Fisk walks into a room, everyone pays attention.
Everyone stands
so
back.
I just kind of assumed like he just kingpinned and Dormammu like flung himself away,
One
power
thing I do,
personality.
one thing I do want to ask, Will, because this one caught me and I think a lot of other people by surprise, was the threat change on Bullseye, and I think it's no shock to anyone that he was widely considered in the community as being the very much at that back end of the curve in terms of effectiveness for his threat level. But the question it pondered to me was that when you guys are both creating a new character and then looking at the new characters and errataing them, do you have like a core base that is a character at 2 threat can do this, these are its core stats, and it can have this much, and then the more you add on, then it creeps up into the threat, higher threat level? Or do you do it the other way around? Do you decide what you want a character to do and then gauge what threat level that character should be based on what it's able to do? Or a mixture of both?
It's kind of a mixture of both. So the way in which the design process works, and I'm fortunate enough to get to design most of the initial character briefs as the lead designer. But even when other folks like Pagani has done several of the great characters like Magneto and Thanos, I always turn to Pagani whenever we have to do like a big monster. When there's a high threat, he loves designing super OP things that we then tone back down to make them like useful. But I think he's very good at the like, okay, this thing has to break the mold. How do we do it? And our new dev Sarah is a big comic book fan, so we like to bring in people to the design point if they have a very strong affinity for characters, because that at the end of the day is the design goal, is to create the characters that feel like they stepped out of the comic book. And if you have somebody who's really passionate and just loves a character to death, Josh is a great example. He loves Daredevil. Daredevil is like his pride and joy. So Josh was very instrumental in the Daredevil design process, and he had a lot of feelings and he had a lot of crazy ideas, and we kind of refined those back down and we say, okay, this is what we can do, this is what we do. But when you step forward and you do that initial design, it's you kind of say, okay, I think within the generalized placement, and this is another MCP kind of core design philosophy, is we always approach the characters from the standpoint of this is the Marvel team up issue, not the characters from a solo issue, right?
Yep.
And so, you know, when you read Avengers or you read Guardians of the Galaxy or whatever, but Avengers is a great one because it pulls together so many characters that have individual runs where they are so much more powerful than they are when they're with the Avengers. You know, you think like Black Panther, Captain America, Iron Man, Captain Marvel. If you read any of those solo adventures, you're like, they don't need a team. They are doing just fine.
Yeah.
And then they put them on a team, and all of a sudden the power levels just go because the point of those stories is not the character's power, but the characters working together to overcome something greater. And that's exactly what Crisis Protocol is doing. So, you know, you kind of look at it in terms of, okay, where does this character fit within the team story that we're telling? As well as what, you know, where are we in the character's life cycle? Because there are definitely stronger and weaker versions of characters if they have a long comics history, depending on the creative teams and the narratives and stuff like that. So it kind of just goes together. And then what happens is that package goes to the main group. We talk about it a lot. We compare it to other things. We might make adjustments to either abilities. Typically, we try to maintain the threat value that was set because a lot of times the threat value is also determined based around like affiliations. So we know this character is going to go into these affiliations. This affiliation would benefit the most from an X, Y, or Z threat, you know?
Which I gather is harder in. I gather it's harder in some. Like you look at Asgard and you go, well, they're all Asgardian, right? They're all sixes. Like how on earth do you balance that?
They're all huge, right? And some affiliations, you know, do have strong thematics of just being powerful. Asgardians is a good one, right? Most of their characters are higher threat. You have the Valkyrie at a 3, but you know they're just a beefy character faction. Brotherhood of Mutants is another one whose design was very much originally like it's going to have all these huge threat characters. It's just going to be a small but really powerful core, you know, between your Juggernauts and your Magnetos and your everything else that goes into it, your Sabretooths and all that. And so things get designed around that. And that can go into tactic cards. You know, Black Order attack is another one where it's like this is a pretty small, cohesive core of like murder machines. What do their team tactic cards want to do? What needs to get added to that? What are the threat values we're looking at there, and how does that impact stuff? But tweaks are always made, you know, and there certainly have been times, several times in playtests where there can be this tension of we hit the core of the character. Everyone's like the character is amazing. It feels like playing the character. But they're either too strong or they're too underpowered. And then the question becomes, okay, well, do we just adjust the threat?
Yeah.
And I think Bullseye was one of those characters where when we were testing him, I always go back to this because I just think it's funny. During the testing and everything, he was one of the few characters where everyone in testing agreed that he was kind of like the ideal 3 threat character. He did what he did it very well. And he didn't feel overpowered or underpowered. That was the feedback. And I think at the time, you know, again, it was pretty accurate. But then as things grow and you see the game like evolve and expand, it was like, oh, he doesn't quite do enough. And we talk about this in some of the articles that we put up too. You know, Iron Man was similar. He was this very focused range blaster character in the core set to introduce the idea of like a very durable turret and do his Stark repulsor technology stuff and hang in the back. And he was very good at it within the core set, but then characters came out and questions came out and I was like, oh, he's not quite good enough to be that specialized. So I think Bullseye kind of fell into that. And as we were looking at characters to adjust during that process, we kind of looked at Bullseye and we said, well, he does everything he needs to do. Like, this is Bullseye.
He definitely feels like Bullseye, right? He plays like Bullseye. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just he wasn't hitting the mark. So it was one of those ones like very instantly. It was like, okay, well, to retool him in a way that would make him fit, you know, the field of 3s was way more dangerous in terms of losing the character than simply saying, if he does everything we think he needs, but everyone, like the feedback, the general consensus is he doesn't do enough for his threat. What if we just dropped his threat? And so we tested with that, and it was an instant hit. And I think it was also really compelling to do that, not just because it allowed us to preserve the core of what was there, but one of the deficiencies for Criminal Syndicate in general was the lack of an affiliated 2 threat. And you can kind of argue that Cabal like definitely is happy with another 2 threat as well. I think every affiliation doesn't mind having, you know, a couple of 2 threats in their back pocket.
I think no matter what player you are, you're always welcome for an extra 2 threat to
Yes.
slot in your roster, right? We like a couple of them in there at least, so another option is always welcome.
It's good for flexibility of list building for sure.
Oh, definitely.
So that just made, you know, all of that kind of made the whole like, oh, let's reduce his threat. It just worked. It was one of those moments where you're just like, this is such the elegant and right solution that there's no reason not to take it.
And it is weird because we've, you know, as part of the community, whether it's on the Discord or on Facebook or anything else, you know, there's lots of conversations, and Bullseye comes up time and time again when people were doing tier lists and everything else. And people came up with loads of ways to make him better. But I don't think anyone came up, you know, as part of the community, just drop him down to 2. Like, take a stamina off him, was it a stamina and a mystic defense, I think? And then, and you look at it and you go, yeah, he is now a brilliant 2 threat. A brilliant 2 threat. So yeah, it worked really well. Last question I've got on the errata piece, because if I don't ask this question, I know there'll be a couple of people that are a bit mad with me. Will we see any of the gems in as part of the errata set? Are they things that are being looked at the moment as well as the characters, or are we just sticking on the characters for the moment?
Yeah, there are going to be a couple of changes to a couple of gems. Actually, 2 of them. 2 of them are getting adjustments. One is pretty minor. The space gem is going from threat 2 to threat 1.
Okay.
And then another one is kind of a complete rework, and that is the time gem.
Oh wow! Okay.
So there's going to be an article that'll go online as well, which will talk a little bit about the gem changes and stuff and the whys. But effectively, with the way the gem rules, the gem bearer rules had changed, and that you're locked into them and stuff. One of the things we talked about initially was it would kind of be nice to have all of the gems at threat 1. We felt like the space gem was a bit it had been overvalued in testing compared to like everything we have now, and its effects and stuff in terms of the game. So we felt, you know, we did testing at dropping its points value. We felt really good about that. It was very, very successful. The time gem was a bear even when we were designing it the first time. All the gems were interesting because they're so powerful, and yet you're trying to condense them into this like thematic thing that works in the game, and doesn't have the power to like crack universes in half. The time gem and the reality gems were the toughest, and the reality gem was really happy with kind of where we wound up with that, and it's very powerful. It's very thematic. But the time gem, you know, unfortunately, I think it opens up so many plays that are kind of unintended, like undesigned for like opportunities. And so we took the opportunity to kind of go back and reevaluate and talk about, okay, well, how do we fix that? What can we do? And where we really wound up was changing its whole shtick in general. And to kind of give you the sneak preview, from it now effectively works as like a better recalibration matrix on a stick, which still kind of sticks to the themes of you know, manipulating time and messing with like reality and temporal stuff, but removes the unintended play patterns and the abuses that can come from being able to take like 3 moves in a turn, or you know, multiple actions and stuff.
Thanos punching somebody 3 times in the face and giving them a bad day.
So that was that one there'll be an article and stuff on that. And
that feels really thematic as well, though. That feels like,
Yeah.
that does feel really thematic for the time gem, because it's like probably more so than getting an extra action, because actually you're taking back something that's already happened and having a do-over, right? That kind of feels like it's probably more thematic than what you've got now. So that's really cool. That's really cool. And I've got to say, I think most people are super happy with the direction that you've gone in terms of how the gems are going to work. I think, it gives a lot more flexibility when it comes to roster building. It lets people include more characters that they enjoy taking, and similar with the tactics cards as well, being able to include more of those. I think you guys spoke about it at Ministravaganza, the sort of big comic book sort of action moments, which a lot of the character cards kind of replicate really well, but maybe with only 8 slots, you don't always get the room to include them in. So I think as a general feedback, really, really happy with both of those changes. They've been really well received.
Perfect. Yeah. We talked about this a little bit with the gem change. I think one of the biggest, for me, one of the things that I always felt we had not succeeded on with the gems is, I think the original structure that we came up with, and I take ownership because I think it was my initial suggestion that this is how gems work. They become part of your roster and then you can add them or not. But on reflection, it was like, I always felt, unhappy with that decision sadly, after it came out in the wild, and I thought about it, and because it removed one of the most exciting parts about Crisis Protocol, which is the characters. And gems are cool, but the idea that a player has to sacrifice the ability to take another one of their favorite characters to tell their Marvel story in order to take, the time gem or the reality gem from a gameplay perspective, it always felt like we had kind of missed the mark of one of our core fundamentals, which we've talked about a couple times now, which is that the characters are the most important thing to Crisis Protocol.
Yeah.
That's why we're here. We're here to play with super awesome Marvel characters and tell that narrative on the table.
And you know what?
With a really cool game.
If Corvus has managed to collect the reality gem, there's no way he's leaving it behind in battle, right? So he's sacrificing his wife to take a 2-threat, right? If he needs to take that gem with him. So yeah, I think it makes sense. Will, one of the other things I wanted to talk about, and I suppose it does go into that pre-planning thing and then having to look at things that you couldn't always prepare for. And as you say, when things go out into the wild, that's when you get the real beta testing, right? Is when it actually is released into the open. And we've seen one group of changes before to the tactics cards with the banned and restricted lists. I know there's a lot of talk in the community at the moment, especially around 2 cards in particular, and sort of rumblings about, are we going to see more cards added to either of those lists? 2 cards I want to talk about in particular, and then maybe a wider conversation, is All You've Got. We mentioned that card earlier. People feel that it's very overpowered for what it costs. And then also a bit of Rivals. And I think the general consensus is people want to see All You've Got thrown away and put in the banned list, and bit of Rivals put into that restricted list. I appreciate you might not be able to go into any details of what may or may not be happening, but can we expect something in the not too distant future to happen around tactics cards again?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, as we've talked about a few times, every time the banned and restricted updates come, Pagani is always really great about putting an article together with our thoughts and kind of reiterating the whole idea behind banned and restricted. But yeah, those lists exist again as an ability to prune the garden, to tend and pull up weeds. There are times where we just miss things. I think we talked about this with Hired Muscle. That card, when it was in playtesting, with all of the playtest games we played, and it was in playtesting for probably 9 months, if not a little longer based on how our cycles work and stuff, no one had an issue with it. In fact, most of the playtesters were like, this card's kind of trash. It's cute. It does what it does, but it's nothing to write home about. But it took a release into the wild and one very creative individual, and then a couple more to try it out. And all of a sudden there's this unforeseen interaction or unintended interaction with how it works with certain crises, and now it's a huge problem. That's why a banned and restricted list exists. It's to be able to address those things. But it's important to note that the reason that the banned and restricted list pacing might feel very slow is because it's not meant as a tool to solve the interesting and important tactical decisions that the game is trying to make, right? When new things come out, they are always more powerful because people don't know how to answer them yet.
Yeah.
I laugh a little bit at times. Like, one of the best things about the job is that you get to see hot takes. And because we do testing and then we release like 18 months, 24 months later, you get double the hot takes. So sometimes it's like reliving things over and over because the playtester hot takes are exactly like the community hot takes at first. Sometimes those hot takes are wildly different. And it's always interesting to kind of to watch as people actually get experience and reps in with the thing, to notice, like, is it as good as people thought? Is it not as good as people thought? Did people find new and unique things that we didn't think about? Did the community come up with ways to solve that? Bitter Rivals is a great example because it's not that it didn't have counterplay. The problem was that the counterplay ultimately was itself. And that is just not acceptable. When the best counterplay you have against something is to just take it with you, like take it as well, that's a pretty good indication you're going to wind up on that ban list. But it's important that there's a time allowed to let players figure things out, right? Everything we do is not about coming in and being like, oh, people are mad about this because it seems really strong or it's doing really well. Like, again, maybe if you were going for perfectly balanced, you'd be like, this thing slightly breaks the main line. Well, we have to get rid of it, but we're not. And I think there's so much to explore that we want to give the community time to be creative, to be inventive, to come up with answers. And it's similar in the playtest process. One of the things we're always watching for with our playtesters and asking them to do is like, okay, you found this problem, can you solve it? Out of everything that's here, what can you solve? Before we come in and make changes to the rules themselves during the testing process, it's important to be like, well, can you solve this? Like, is this really a problem or is this an initial reaction?
Yeah.
And then you start to balance, like, okay, how many different solutions are there to it? What do those things look like? So, sometimes a card will last 6 months and we'll be like, okay, this is clearly a problem. Bitter Rivals was one of those. Sometimes the card gets a lot longer turn and we kind of wait, because we also plan in and plant, there is this idea that we do ask questions that we know we will answer later. It's kind of like planting the seed and then letting it grow to fruition. And that is probably the most enjoyable thing about the game, is when people are like, this is the dominant strategy, nobody can beat it. And you're like, here's a new release. And it like messes with the dominance and everything gets like, and that's what makes living games so much fun. It's always a constant cycle of new discovery and new things. And then it's like, once everybody's like, the game is solved, you're like, oh, you just wait. There's more to it. Or we don't even have to release anything. Everyone's like, the game is solved. And some brilliant, or inspired individual from the community comes out and says, well, what about this? And everyone's like, oh my,
this is how how I break your game.
Yeah. No, nobody plays this way. And I think it's one of those interesting things about like where we are as a world and a global community is, even though we have access to like all of these different, regions and we can talk across, oceans and we can determine a consensus, not everybody is engaged in that same conversation. So while it may seem like it's really big, all it takes is like one community somewhere that doesn't, go on social media and talk about stuff, to show up at a convention somewhere and be like, we play this way. And everyone be like, what? We've never seen, no one takes that character and no one uses that tactic card. And then they just did this. And now like everything shifts, right?
Yeah.
There's so many combinations. There's so many potentials that it's like a lot of times the ecosystem will balance itself if you let it. And so we want to be really careful about only, if you prune a plant too much, it dies. So,
And I do love that about a game in that you can have a release for a character pack that has a tactics card in it that completely revitalizes a character that's been put on the bench for the last year and a half, right? I mean, Corsair Iron Man, Helios Laser Bombardment came out, and all of a sudden everyone's going, how can I fit how can I fit Iron Man in my core so I can take Helios Laser Bombardment and one shot a Dormammu or a Hulk or whatever it is you're trying to do with it. So yeah, it is crazy when you see that side of it. So Will, to kind of round things off then, obviously you guys are all massive comic book fans anyway, right? You love Marvel. You wouldn't be doing this if you didn't as well. And you've already mentioned that you know 18 to 24 months in advance what's coming in the pipeline. But kind of outside of that, what is it that you're most interested to bring to the game in terms of an individual character or an affiliation that we haven't seen yet? Which are the ones that you're really excited to bring us?
I get asked this question a lot, and then I always have to be kind of careful because
you don't want to give away things that are coming out in the next 18 to 24 months.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it's like, oh, you mentioned this is going to come. I'll go back to my classic example though, because there are many characters that I love. Like Ghost Rider, definitely one of the ones that I wanted in the game from the very start because I just love that character. Spider-Man, whole reason I love comics and Marvel. 6 years old, mom handed me a Spider-Man comic she bought from the grocery store, and that was it. That's the character for me that really defined a lot of my adult values and morals and how I view the role of what a good hero is. There can never be enough Spider-Man for me. But the things from a perspective that I really like, it's always the characters that are weird or that let the game and then push our design philosophies in unexpected ways. So I always kind of go to Sentry. To me, Sentry is such a cool Marvel character with an interesting backstory, but also such a conundrum when it comes to how do you represent that character on the table. Because you can just be like, well, here's Sentry, and he does Sentry things, and it's like, the core of Sentry is that inner struggle between Sentry and the Void, right? And how that character is always walking a super fine line of unleashing this incredibly powerful evil entity and becoming the Void. And creative teams have struggled with this a lot in terms of that character's path and what he chooses to do. Sometimes he goes into isolation, sometimes he really becomes unstable, and in the Dark Avengers run, right? But to me, I love that one because I think the character is really cool, but putting that narrative on the tabletop and then making players have to plan strategy and tactics around that is really cool, right? How does it work? I don't know. The second that I know, we will make that character because I think it will be amazing. But those are the kinds of things that I think are really fun. It's awesome to be able to play with characters that you have a strong affinity to, that really excite you. Dr. Voodoo, I've mentioned on stream several times, one of my all-time favorite characters. Was so excited to get to do him, and I definitely got weird with how Brother Daniel worked and how that character did, because I had this very keen idea in terms of what I really wanted from that character, and then it was up to everyone else to rein me in. And that's the yin and yang I talk about. The whole dev team is amazing, but Pagani and I have worked together long enough now that we're really good counterbalances. I will come in and have the hopes and dreams and be like, it must do this, and this is how I think it works. And he'll push back and be like, we can't do this. And I'll be like, but can't you? And then we'll argue a little bit, and we'll come to this compromise where he's like, okay, I think we can do it this way. Does this fit? And I'm like, yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. And we talk. But it's the challenge of creating things and doing weird things that are true to the comic character, but then also open up these new and exciting possibilities from the tabletop. for me, you know, my favorite things in games are Pagani is very much on the, he looks at efficiency, he looks at planning, you know, he's the competitive minded, like he can do the math and he can figure out the plays and all of that. And so I think one of the things that has made Crisis Protocol so unique and special is that we took that mentality, but then we combined it with my neutral, chaotic like personality, where I love it when plans go wrong and then you have to puzzle solve out, right? Like,
It's one of my
so
favorite parts of this game with certain characters as well,
yeah,
where you roll a dice and something could happen, and who knows?
yeah. And so it's, you know, it's like, it's finding that right balance between, you can come in with a plan, but that plan is meaningless once the game starts, meaningless in quotes, because you're going to have to adapt. And the real player skill comes at the table, in terms of like, okay, this didn't go right. These dice didn't go my way. I can use these rerolls to try to make sure that this thing's going to work, but I still have a high variance. I'm going to use these abilities, but I can't really pre-plan because of the way the alternating activation works. And my opponent could choose to do this, or they could choose to do that, and priority rotates. And so the whole thing is designed to create a crisis that players then problem solve their way out of. And I think that that natural adaptability and problem solving, you know, that chaotic element, to me is what the games that I love the most have that in it. Um, and so I think you know, Crisis Protocol to me has really hit a good balance between the, you need to think about your roster, you need to think about your strategies, you need to come in with a plan, but then you also have to have, you know, that adaptability and that flexibility to be like, okay, well, my plan's not working the way I wanted it to. What am I doing around that? And then of course you throw in all of the Marvel thematic elements to it, and you get to throw things and all that. And all that's to say, so characters like, you know, Sentry and the Void that offer these really weird counterplays. Like, I love the idea that, you know, the Sentry's really, really powerful, but maybe if you overload him with power, the Void comes out, and the Void is like also like more scary, but is scary for everyone. You know, like maybe he deals damage to everyone on the table. So like your opponent can force you into that if you've got a lot of squishy characters, and now the Void is like murdering your characters as well as the other characters. And so you're like, okay, well, I need to get him back. How do I do that? So you ask these really interesting like questions, you offer these really interesting counterplay points, and now the game becomes this conversation between two people. And you know, at the end of the day, one of the things I'm always very, very big about is, there are a lot of games out there that I feel like when I play them, I forget the other person is standing across the table.
Yeah,
And to me, that's not why I play these games, right? To me, a great game involves every player at the table in a conversation and a shared experience, and we create a story together. Now, that story could be like me and Josh playing, or like Dallas and Josh playing is like the penultimate of this, where they literally tell their own comic book on the table. They're not worried about who wins or loses. They're not worried about best plays. They are worried about working with each other to create this comic book in miniature form that fits the narrative and fits the way they think the characters would react, and, you know, mitigates the dice in terms of like, oh, clearly in this panel he was coming at him but he tripped, or the door closed or whatever, and that's why he boffed it, or she just hit that right point, this was the moment. You know, or you have like the we're coming in, we're going to flex our skills, and we're going to see who comes out on top, and we're going to challenge each other, and we're going to become better players because of it. And I'm going to learn something, and you're going to learn something, and one person's going to walk away with victory, or anything in between. But a great game is one that connects the players across the table. And the second that you forget that players across the table, I think the game, it just, that's when games get into a lot of trouble. That's when communities get in trouble. You know, it goes back to that. There's always that classic dichotomy, that tension between casual and competitive. You know, I just talked about two very different mentalities. But if you remember that the primary game is your interactions, your connection with that person across the table, it doesn't mean that, you know, the competitive person has to play down, quote unquote, which I don't even like, has to change their mindset or their game to the casual person, because the casual person wants to tell a story. You know, Josh and Gani play games all the time with each other, and they have a blast doing it. But they both know going in that, like, what they've had that conversation. They learn to gauge and react to each other. You know, there are days where Josh comes in and he wants to beat everybody up. He doesn't want to tell a story. He wants to win. And boy, he tries. He tries his hardest, and sometimes it works.
I do like that about this game though, where it is really about the crisis and playing the objectives. And I think a lot of people forget about that sometimes, especially new players coming into the game, where they feel like all they want to do is KO and daze and then KO their opponent.
Yeah.
But so very, very, very lastly, then Will, of all of the affiliations that we've got available to us at the moment, I think it's 18 now in total. I probably know that better than you because, as you say, you're living 24 months ahead from the rest of us.
No idea. We actually had a funny conversation last night where Pagani, he has a local game store he goes to and he plays on their game nights and stuff. And somebody was asking about a character. It might have been Black Cat. And they were like, "Hey, you're the lead developer. What affiliation is Black Cat?" And he's like, "Dude, I have no idea. Like, go look at it on your phone." You've got like so much information, and just like every player, right? You know, if you have that question, chances are we might have the same question in terms of in the moment, right? It's like, that's why the rules are there. That's why we have documents. No one is a perfect repository. Like, I don't think anyone that we have on the office has the photographic memory that everybody wishes they had. So,
well, some of the players in the community do, but only of a snapshot of what is here and now, not also having to contend with what's in the future. But of what we've got now, what is your go-to? If me and you were to sit across from a table now and you could pick any affiliation with any leader, what would be your go-to one to just have fun playing this game?
Man, I think so. There are a lot of affiliations that I have affinities to. Midnight Suns is probably the one that I would pick right now if it was just for one. Like, if we were just going to sit down and play, it would probably be Midnight Suns because it has like all of my greatest hit characters. Like,
there's so many good characters in that affiliation.
Yeah. I love Blade. We've already talked about how Ghost Rider is one of my top favorites. Dr. Voodoo's in it. Like, I can grab characters that I really love out of that. I've been asked before, like, if you could only pick one affiliation ever, what would you pick? And my answer is always unaffiliated, because to me, I've never been very good at sitting still. Like, I'm not like Pagani and other players who want to put in the reps and do the same thing and learn something in and out to become really proficient at it. Again, chaotic neutral, like, what I want to do is just grab the things that I think are cool and throw them on the table and see what happens. So, you know, I have zero problems being like, I will never play affiliation, because it just means that I get to create like more weird scenarios with all these different characters and, you know, go with what my emotional state is and what characters I'm reading currently that I love and all of that stuff. Even choosing affiliation, you get to do that. But, you know, for me, it's like, I'm just too flighty. I'm too winding river to be like, this is my course, I'm sticking to it. But Midnight Suns is definitely way up there. I mean, so many of those characters and the story and like the whole team and what it does, it's great. It's great.
Oh, cool. Well, Will, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I think it's late for me, early for you, but it's really, really appreciated. And I know that all of the viewers will really appreciate the sort of more in-depth conversations that we've had. So yeah, I mean, just again, thank you so much. And for me, and I think, as I say, I speak for most people in the community, just you guys keep on doing what you're doing with Marvel, because we are absolutely loving it at the moment. Every release has just been so good. Looking as a Brotherhood player, really looking forward to seeing what Juggernaut is going to bring to the table in terms of a character card. But yeah, just keep on doing what you guys are doing, because it's a fantastic game, and I know that sentiment is shared throughout the vast majority of the community. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate you having me on and, you know, sitting here and listening to me ramble for an hour. It's always fun. I love talking about this stuff, and, you know, I'm very happy and super humbled that so many people have just really enjoyed the game. And, yeah, everything we do when we go into work, it really motivates us to make sure that we're doing the best that we can to make sure the game continues to be great and that people love it and that we'll grow this amazing community together. So thank you again.
No, brilliant. Thank you very much. Guys, as always, it leaves me just enough time to say stay well, keep safe, and until next time, bye for now.